Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of How I Built It. Today I get to talk to Nancy Hildebrandt about building out a good support system. She was working with Beaver Builder at the time of this interview, and we talked about the importance of creating good documentation, listening to your customers, and so much more related to support. We have so much that we even have a bonus episode. We'll get into all of that and more, but first, a word from our sponsors. This season of How I Built It is brought to you by two fantastic sponsors. The first is Liquid Web. If you're running a membership site, an online course, or even a real estate site on WordPress, you've likely already discovered many hosts that have optimized their platforms for a logged out experience, where they cache everything. Sites on their hardware are great for your sales and landing pages, but struggle when your users start logging in. At that point, your site is as slow as if you were on $3 hosting. Liquid Web built their managed WordPress platform optimized for sites that want speed and performance, regardless of whether a customer is logged in or logged out. Trust me on this, I've tried it out and it's fast. Seriously fast. Now, with their single site plan, Liquid Web is a no-brainer for anyone whose site is actually part of their business and not just a site promoting their business. Check out the rest of the features on their platform by visiting them at buildpodcast.net/liquidweb. That's buildpodcast.net/liquidweb. It's also brought to you by Jilt. Jilt is the easiest way to recover abandoned shopping carts on WooCommerce, Easy Digital Downloads, and Shopify. Your e-commerce clients could be leaving literally thousands of dollars on the table, and here's why. 70% of all shopping carts are abandoned prior to checkout. Yes, you heard that right. 70% of shoppers never make it to checkout. And that's why you need to introduce your clients to Jilt. Jilt uses proven recovery tactics to rescue that lost revenue. It's an easy win that lets you boost your client's revenue by as much as 15%, and it only takes 15 minutes of your time to set up. Jilt fully integrates with WooCommerce, EDD, and Shopify, and you can completely customize the recovery emails that Jilt sends to match your client's branding using its powerful drag-and-drop editor, or by digging into the HTML and CSS. Even better, Jilt's fair pricing means your clients pay only for the customers they actually engage, and you get to earn a cut of that through Jilt's partner program. Whether you have clients that process 1 sale per month or 10,000 sales per month, be the hero and help them supercharge their revenue with Jilt. Check them out at buildpodcast.net/Jilt. That's buildpodcast.net/JILT. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of How I Built It, the podcast that asks, how did you build that? Today, my guest is Nancy Hildebrandt. We got connected through the fellas at Beaver Builder. She's doing some work for them. So, Nancy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Joe.
Oh, awesome. Thanks so much for being on the show. I appreciate you coming on. And we're going to be talking about something that is perhaps a bane in the side of many, or a thorn in the side of many developers, which is documentation. But before we get into that, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do?
So I come actually from a technical writing information architect background, and I retired from high tech. I used to work for the Java programming group at Oracle, and I retired a couple of years ago, and I started something I've been doing as a hobby since about 1997, which is building websites for very small business people. So in the course of doing this, I discovered Beaver Builder, and that's the story I'm going to tell today, is how I came to write the knowledge base for Beaver Builder.
Awesome. So you worked for Oracle back when Java was first created, essentially, right? 1995?
I was working for Sun actually, and then Sun got acquired by Oracle. And so, yeah, that's how I came to work for Oracle.
Nice. Very nice. That's pretty great. So you have a pretty strong background in a monolith in the tech field.
Yeah, information architecture is really about how it's like one step higher than technical writing. So it's about the best way to structure documentation and then what tools are best for presenting your documentation.
Absolutely. So do you think that your perspective, like working, first of all, in information architecture, second of all, for a company like Sun, has brought like a very unique perspective to the WordPress space, which is mostly like open source, startup, kind of like a startup-y kind of feel, you know?
Yeah, well, Java's actually open source. So, and they operate under a GPL2 license. So I was familiar with the license already. And so, the WordPress model of open source is not new to me. And then, of course, with my tech writer's bent, I do tend to evaluate products in terms of how much support I'm going to get with their documentation.
Gotcha. And so my last question about kind of your intro is, I don't want to lead you to the answer that I expect you're going to give, but how do you feel the state of documentation is, just kind of like in the WordPress space, maybe in the freelance space, in the small business space, with the tools that you use?
Yeah, well, I think there are two sides to it. One is that most of the products in the WordPress space are done by fairly small companies who can't really afford a big documentation effort. And so the developers tend to write it themselves. Some are more interested in it, some are less interested in it. Some know more about it, some know less. On the other side of the coin, if you know the famous acronym RTFM, read the effing manual.
Yeah.
Documentation should be a last resort. If your product were perfectly designed from a usability standpoint, you wouldn't need any documentation. It would just be apparent how to use it. But that's never the case. So documentation sort of fills in the gaps. And so when I write documentation, I expect that users will exploit just about every other resource before they'll finally resort to going and looking for some written help. And I would like to talk about the difference between video help and written help. And I can do that later in the tips, if you like.
Yeah, that would be great when we talk about kind of like building documentation, because I know I do a lot of video work and written work.
Yes.
But so I'd love to just kind of talk a little bit about that. But I love what you said there. Documentation should be a last resort, right? When you buy a car, it's not like you read the manual before you drive it off the lot, right? You intuitively know how to drive the car.
Exactly. But if it comes time to change that flat tire, you'd better have that manual in your glove box.
Yep, absolutely. Very cool. I love that. So we're going to be talking about specifically building the knowledge base for Beaver Builder. So you mentioned that you used it for some of your web design projects, but when you actually set out to build the knowledge base, what kind of research did you do as far as like what you're going to cover? Are you going to start from the very beginning or figuring out like what are the pain points for users?
Right. So Beaver Builder already had a knowledge base when I started using Beaver Builder myself as a tool. And it was a rather typical knowledge base. Well, it was probably better than most, and they probably had about 50 articles. They were written in in a WordPress format, on their site, probably as, custom post types. And they were okay, but they were sort of a typical developer's eye view of how to write a helpful document. So, and my best analogy to that is I used to have a friend who was a 747 pilot, and he said, as a pilot, we need to know like how to balance the fuel load because it's different when we're taking off and when we're cruising and when we're landing. And he said, you go to the Boeing manual, and it's got a chapter on the primary fuel tank and the secondary fuel tank. So you're getting all this conceptual knowledge that you really don't need. All you need to know is what you're doing at each stage of the flight. So it's similar to that. Documentation should be task-based. So you need to do, the most important thing to do is a task analysis. What are your users trying to accomplish with your product? Then what you do is you just write a set of titles for articles that address each task. And there you've got your knowledge base. And for anything that users would need to know conceptually that they don't have from that, then you write a few conceptual articles. For example, we have an article on, you can't use Page Builder in Beaver Builder to build archive documents, archive web pages. So a lot of our users don't know what an archive means and how that's different in WordPress. They don't have that much knowledge of WordPress. So then you need a conceptual article about, okay, what's an archive? Why is it different in WordPress? That sort of thing. Yeah, but the
Gotcha.
main focus is on task-based documentation. So once you figure out what your users want to do, it becomes very easy to write the articles that they need. And if you're not sure, you can just talk to your support team. Or if you're the support team, you know what kinds of questions your users are asking. How do I do such and such? How do I do such and such? And you just address those questions that users have.
Man, that's fantastic. I'm going to reiterate what you just said again, which is documentation should be task-based. I
Yes.
use the same exact wording in my online courses, right? I say task-based courses because, like you said, if you have a conceptual course, people aren't going to necessarily know exactly how to apply that knowledge. They want to know, I need to do X. How do I do X?
Yes, exactly.
So, and I'm guessing, I don't have any data to back this up, but I'm guessing the sort of conceptual learning is a function of how we've been taught for years, right? In the classroom, the
Yes.
flipped classroom is a thing now. But, even when I was going through school in the 90s, it was, here is a concept, here's how it works, now here's homework on that concept.
Yes, exactly.
So,
Yes, the manual is dead. There are no more manuals. And users want to get in and get out. So even within a task-based topic, they need to be able to scan that topic and get just the information they need.
right, absolutely. Which is probably why, like, YouTube tutorials on how to do, like, home improvement is so popular, right? Like,
Yes.
yeah, man, that's fantastic. It's so cool to hear you say that too, because it's as an educator, I found that to be really important, and I'm glad that it's starting to be integrated into, like formal documentation, right? Like real
Yes.
documentation.
Yes. And by the way, documentation has a bad name from a long history of bad documentation. And so the documentation people, the tech writers, have been looking for other words for documentation for a long time. So online help also has a bad name because online help has been very poor in the past. So they've tried user assistance, and now Beaver Builder's got a knowledge base. No matter what you call it, people will use it as a last resort. So, you can pick the term you want. I'll be talking about documentation just to differentiate written help from video help and other kinds of help, but it doesn't imply a manual. It just implies something that's written down.
Right. Yeah, and that makes sense. It's so funny that you mentioned names. When I was in IT at the University of Scranton, I worked in an area that was like level 3 kind of support. I was a programmer, but our first line of support was the Technology Support Center, which had just been rebranded from the Help Desk. And they rebranded probably because Help Desk got a bad name, but or about a bad rep. And I remember I referred to them as the Help Desk one time, and one of the managers there got really mad at me. He was like, "We're not the Help Desk." I'm like, "Oh, so you don't help people?" Like, so it's just funny to hear that,
Yes.
certain terms come with a little bit of baggage. So
You're right.
so the question I usually ask after this is revolves around talking to other people, kind of like in a mastermind setting. In your case, you mentioned talking to support folks and customers and things like that, but how helpful do you find those conversations with people when you're building documentation?
Extremely helpful. And one of the wonderful things about documentation these days is we used to write documentation in a black hole. We'd imagine the customer, we might do a couple of user studies, but we'd imagine a customer and then we'd write for that imaginary customer, and then we'd never get any feedback about it. But now with social media, Beaver Builder's Facebook page has over 10,000 members at the moment. So I get immediate feedback on what I write. I can say, hey, I put this new article out there. What do you think? And they tell me. Or they say, I searched for this in the knowledge base, but I couldn't find it. And I say, well, what'd you search on? And then I can add that search term and so on. So that kind of immediate feedback where I can keep tweaking and fine tuning the documentation is invaluable.
Man, that's another great point, right? Because people building software today probably don't have a really good perspective on what it was like doing things like cut off from the actual user, right? The people that you were aiming to help.
Yes.
But, when I was in grad school, we kind of talked about like user stories, and we would invent these users, but they were still just inventions, right? Like we never got to the point of talking to actual users.
Exactly, because that's time consuming and costly.
Yeah.
And then I also interact with the support team a lot at Beaver Builder. They're great because they're very interactive, and they come to me and say, "Hey, I'm getting a lot of requests for, this particular problem. How about if we write something about this and I can just point them to it in the knowledge base?" So then, that's when documentation really starts to make you money. When you start being able to reduce your support costs because people are saving time by pointing people out, to the appropriate article in the knowledge base, then you're really saving something.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. You're essentially support for support, right? Because when I talked to the guys at Give WP, they talked about how important their support team was for getting insight into customers, not just for the help aspect of it, but for the new features aspect of it. But what you said is, pardon the pun, right on the money. You're creating a knowledge base so that support people don't need to spend an hour researching a topic for somebody, right? They could just say, "Oh, this article does that."
And they don't have to keep writing the same answer over and over. And, the more you write it, the more you tend to abbreviate it, and then you're leaving out steps that people might need to know. So, then you've got the back and forth. "Well, I didn't understand what you said about this." So this way they just say, "Oh, okay, here's your problem. Here's the article on it. Go do it." Done.
Man, that's great. I want to talk about that just a minute, because the kind of psychology of support, I feel like it's never come across my desk or come across this podcast, but you're right. If you do a task over and over and over again, you're probably going to take shortcuts here and there where you feel you can make them. But when it comes to support, it's not just you doing it over and over again. It's somebody that's seeing that problem for the first time. Yes. So you shouldn't take those shortcuts. Going back to the classroom, that's why your math teacher would teach you the long way and then the short way, right?
Yes.
They wouldn't just teach you the short way.
Right. So that's the beauty of the task-based articles, that they're short, they're very specific, and hopefully, support can use them and just as a pointer.
Yeah, and as you said, a good knowledge base, good documentation will end up saving you money, especially if you have a support team where you need to, you want to handle as many support requests as possible without cutting corners.
Yes. No, I do. I do have some tips later on if we have time when we get to it about, if you're very small and you can't really afford documentation, what you can do. So.
Oh man, I love that. Well, let's move on to the title question then, and then we can get into the tips, because that sounds amazing, and it sounds like it'll be really great for this audience in particular. But
sure.
Let's talk about how did you build the knowledge base at Beaver Builder? And I think we hinted at this a little bit from a conceptual point of view, but the actually creating the documentation, what was that like?
Right. So the way we got into it is I saw a message from the Beaver Builder team on Facebook saying that they were hoping to beef up their knowledge base. And so I wrote them what's called a pain letter, where I said, okay, here's what's wrong with your knowledge base, and here's how I can make it better. And here are my credentials to prove that I know what I'm talking about. So they went for that. I wrote them a detailed project proposal where I told them exactly how I was going to make it better. And then they liked that. So I wrote a project plan that was a phased project plan, so that I think it was 3 phases. So that, knowing that companies, small companies don't have a lot of money to invest in documentation, I wanted something that at the end of each phase, if they felt that was sufficient, they could stop and they would have something that was working. So, at the end of phase 1, I said, okay, here's your initial, what we agreed on. Do you want to continue? And they said yes. So, we just sort of, and now we're just sort of continuing on,
Wow.
happy with each other at this point. But that was the way it was planned and how I got into it. And so it just so happened that at that point, they were so ready to have a new knowledge base. And so we talked about tools, and they had been trying to beef up the search on their current site, and they realized that they were just starting with this new tool for support called Help Scout. A lot of you are probably familiar with that. And Help Scout has an integrated docs knowledge base where it makes it very easy for support to find the topics and integrate the links into their support tickets. And it also sort of gives you an infrastructure because it has the whole setup for writing individual articles and then categorizing those into categories and collections, and then it has a related articles area where you can put in related links to other topics. And if you change the titles of the topics or whatever, all those links automatically adjust. So that part, and it has killer search. So that part that aspect of it was really nice.
Wow. So that sounds like a fantastic tool. We'll dig into that in a minute. But I love that you sent them a pain letter, which basically, I mean, it tells them, right, I understand your problem and I also know how I can fix your problem, right?
Exactly. This is a technique that I learned from job hunting, but it applies very well in other situations like freelancing.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, that's fantastic. And then Help Scout, that has been mentioned on the show quite a bit. I've never actually used it. I probably will start using it this year as I grow my student base. But the integrated docs, right? So you mentioned earlier that Beaver Builder had a bunch of articles, essentially WordPress posts, right? Like blog posts that
Correct.
served as the knowledge base.
Yes.
And then you just mentioned a whole bunch of incredible tools in Help Scout for integrated documentation. How helpful has that been to the support team?
Well, you'd have to ask the support team, but it seems like it's very helpful. And I love, we all interact on Slack because we're all remote workers. And I love the interaction that I have with support where we talk a lot about problems they're having. I monitor the support channel to see what problems they're having and can write topics based on some of the questions that they're asking the developers and so on. So that's a huge help. It seems, I mean, given that support will actually approach me and say, could we have an article on such and such, makes me think that they are using these articles and do find it helpful.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And then the other thing that I have written in the notes here is you can also see like the number of visits to each page.
Yes.
What pages are the most popular?
Yes, so that's another built-in feature of the Help Scout knowledge base is they have metrics so you can see, so I can tell you that when the first month we started, which I think was about a year and a half ago, with the new knowledge base, we had 400 visits that month. We're now having around 59,000 visits per month. And I can see there's an average of 2 pages per visit, and I can see which pages are the most popular. I can see which search terms failed to help me beef up the search. I can add keywords that will improve the search for those fail terms and so on. So that aspect of it is also very helpful for tuning up the knowledge base.
Fantastic. So you notice that it's about 2 pages per visit or per visitor?
Yes.
Do you find that a lot of people end up going to, let's say, page A and then page B because they were looking for page B first, but ended up on page A somehow? Does that make sense?
Yes. That information is actually not available to me. Okay. So I don't know the reason why they looked at 2 pages. Mm-hmm. But I do know that the results list is 91% browsing and only about 9% search. Which is interesting because we do have this very good search, but as the knowledge base gets bigger and bigger, it does get harder to search. One thing that Help Scout, it would be really helpful if they had filters on the search where you could narrow it down to certain collections or certain categories and so on. You can't do that right now. So it may be that search is just getting difficult and people are choosing to browse instead.
Yeah. Perhaps they're just like, I kind of think I know what I'm looking for, so I'm going to click through to the things. I mean, that's my behavior too. As much as I know how to manipulate searches from like advanced operators and stuff like that, I still choose to do the old browse, like click and browse. So
interesting.
Yeah.
So I spent the first year trying to improve the search figure, and it just didn't change. So now I'm trying to improve the browsing experience.
Nice. Well, we'll look forward to that. And we have about 10 minutes left. And so there's like 2 questions I usually ask, right? Has the product gone through transformations? What are your plans for the future? Perhaps we can combine that into a short answer and then get to like the fun trade secrets question, because you do have a lot here from our conversation.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Well, yeah, just to answer your question very quickly, I follow Beaver. Beaver Builder has a strong product plan now and in the future, and I just follow their releases. And as you can see, I follow the metrics for the knowledge base. I try to tune it up that way and follow support and follow the Facebook crowd.
Nice, very nice. So now we will get to the title question, or I should say my favorite question, which is, do you have any trade secrets for us?
Yes, have a lot. The trade secrets. Yeah, I have many.
Yeah, so let's just kind of go through them because these are all fantastic.
Okay. So first of all, I know that a lot of people like video tutorials, and a lot of people say, I've seen a lot of people say on Facebook, I don't read written documentation, I want video. So I will just say about that my own philosophy, we did a survey when I was in the Java programming group. We did a survey among the developer crowd, the Java developer crowd of, do you prefer video tutorials to written tutorials, or when do you prefer one over the other? And the information that we got back, and it seems so right that this is how this came to be, sort of my belief, is that they like video tutorials for introductory stuff. How do I get started? They really, it really helps you get started. But once they're intermediate users, it's kind of a waste of time for them to sit through a whole video because they're locked into that timing in the video. What they really want is just get in and get out with the information that they need. So what I like to try to do is to have video tutorials cover the basic topics as well as documentation. So whichever people prefer. Some people don't like videos. Some people will only watch videos. So have both for the most basic topics of getting started, and then keep the written docs for the more advanced topics.
Gotcha. So that's really interesting. Do you think that at the intermediate level, like shorter or indexed videos might be helpful? So like we'll have an advanced video that we break down into timestamps or something like that, so that they can kind of read and jump to that point.
That's possible, but one of the problems with video is that if your product changes, if your UI changes, you then have to redo a video, and that's costly. Right. Videos are much more costly than written documentation. The other thing is, and I have this point later, is there's an 80-20 rule in documentation where you focus more on early beginner users, beginner to intermediate. And for more advanced users, they're going to find the answers that they need doing Google searches in forums. And also, like, for example, Beaver Builder has a very large and enthusiastic community of people who love to produce videos on various specific topics. So whatever our knowledge base doesn't cover, you can often find it elsewhere with a video search. But those people are not necessarily trained in doing very well thought out, well structured, basic documentation. So that's really, I think, where our strength should be.
Gotcha. That and to the same point, you can't exactly skim 3 minutes of a video, right? If it's 3 minutes, you have to.
Exactly.
Right. So on that same, you mentioned have the video, have the written documentation. I've seen this before. I've thought that I could do this before, but it ended up like making more work for myself. Have the video, get the transcript, and make the transcript the written documentation. I thought that would totally work for me, but it didn't work for me because my conversational cadence in a video is very different from something I would write out formally and instructions that I would want people to follow. Do you find that that's the same? It's kind of the same?
That's very interesting. So what you often see with, non-trained writers is they might tell you how to do something, but they tell it like it's a story rather than as like a numbered procedure. So you tend to see a lot of phrases like, now you're going to want to go ahead and do this, or now you're going to want to do that. And oh, by the way, you should have set this up to be such and such before you started. So if you're skimming, if you're trying to scan quickly a procedure to figure out what you need to do, that's not very helpful. If you have numbered procedures, first of all, it kind of forces you to put things in a time order. Any prerequisites, first do, if you ever have to say, oh, by the way, it means you've got it ordered wrong. Mm-hmm. And with numbered procedures, with people who are more advanced and they can skip a lot of steps, they just say, oh, I know how to do that. I know how to do that. I know how to do that. And they can get to the meat of what they're trying to do very quickly. Nice.
Very nice. That makes sense. I love that. Cool. So we've talked about videos and written documentations. What other kind of trade secrets do you have for us? What's the next thing that you wanted to mention?
Right. So I'd say we touched on this a little, but if you're going to write the documentation yourself, the best thing you can do is to do that task analysis where you're figuring out what your users want to do with your product. Then just take each of those questions that you figured out and write a title for that. And that there's your knowledge base. just write every title that you wrote for a question becomes a topic, and that topic is task-based, and it should be either procedural steps or it should be a code sample if you're writing for developers, one of the two. Don't tell it like a story. And then if there are any concepts that in the process of writing that, any concepts that you think need to be explained before your viewers can understand what you're talking about, then you add either a short conceptual background at the beginning of the topic or a longer conceptual topic. And that's your basic doc set. And if you're going to hire someone to do this, first of all, it's hard to hire a writer and just expect that they're going to take this sort of information architecture overview of your documentation. So I think the best question to ask them is, if they didn't come to you with a pain letter, ask them what's wrong with the current documentation and what would you propose doing to fix it? And how would you do that? If they can't really come up with an answer, or you can't really find a person like that, then I think the fallback would be you do the task analysis and come up with the questions, and then you give them to the writer and say, here are the topics you should write about. And then the writer can do a better job just, filling in the content for each topic.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense, right? You don't expect somebody on day one of a job to be able to do that job perfectly either. So you want to make sure that they have the right domain knowledge, the right background knowledge to properly teach, because that's essentially what you're doing in documentation, right? You're teaching people how to use your product.
Right. So since you have an education background and a training background, do you have any tips for documentation? I mean, you've had a lot of experience with documentation too, I'm sure.
Yeah, flipping the script. Yeah. So I think the thing that I say the most is it really comes down to like empathy for the user, which is something I think a lot of developers have a hard time with based on my personal experience. And that empathy comes from the things that you talked about, right? Like talking to the users, talking to the support team, doing a task analysis, because all of those things will help you understand where the user's head is at. And then if you do that, when you write your documentation, you write your tutorials or you do your videos, you're going to use the right language, right? I see a lot of people say, well, just click posts, add new. Using the word just or obviously or things like that kind of put down the user, right? They wouldn't be watching your video or reading your documentation if it was easy to them. So, my tips are more from like a kind of a feeling standpoint, right? You want to make sure that you're making the user feel comfortable. But everything that you said is so important in getting to that point because, I know a lot of people say, oh, it's easy, just do this. If you're explaining the task to somebody, then it wasn't easy to them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I like that.
So aside from that, my process for writing documentation of videos is I will do something and then I will write down exactly what I'm doing. So usually what I end up doing for my video tutorials is I'll go through a task, I'll write down the steps, and then I'll undo it all so I can record the video tutorial.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
so that's a good technique. Yeah, I like that.
It's a lot of work, but like you said, making videos is pretty costly, right? Like if I was doing written documentation, I could take a screenshot before each step. With the video, it's a little bit different because you got to do the task and then undo it. So
yeah,
cool.
So I guess my final thought is I've seen cases where documentation makes the difference between whether people buy a product or not. I don't think that necessarily is, a deciding factor for the majority of people, but I do think it becomes very important in keeping your customers. If you have good support and good documentation, that's what's going to keep them loyal.
That is great. That is a good point to end on. I do have a few things left here though, so maybe we'll do, I'll end the episode here. And Nancy, if you have the time, I'd love to keep recording and we can release that as kind of like a bonus part, if that sounds good to you.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
It was totally my pleasure.
What a great conversation with Nancy. I strongly recommend everybody who creates a product or is thinking about creating a product, think about your documentation and your support. We've mentioned this on other episodes of the show, but good support documentation means a better and more efficient time for your support team. And thanks again to our sponsors. Make sure to check out Liquid Web for managed WordPress hosting. I use them on all of my important sites. They are that good. They're over at buildpodcast.net/liquid. and they'll give you 50% off your first 2 months just for being a listener. If you want to save your client or yourself money through abandoned cart recovery, check out Jilt. I've been using them for the past few months, and I am a huge fan of their service and their support. You can find them over at buildpodcast.net/Jilt. For all of the show notes, head over to howibuilt.it/77. If you like the show, head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and a review. It helps people discover us. And finally, as I teased earlier, we do have a bonus episode with Nancy talking about hiring and how to get hired and things like that over on our Patreon. Head over to patreon.com/howibuiltit. You can pledge and support the show yourself for as little as $1 a month. And until next time, get out there and build something.